Good evening, everybody. So, as Paul has just said, a regular visitor to our society, I'm pleased to say. Neil is the Programme Secretary of the Cleveland and Darlington Astronomical Society, and he's been a member there for the past 31 years. It could even be more now, depends when these notes were written. He's been on the committee for 23 years. Sorry?
Committee member for 31 years.
A committee member for 31 years. I do apologise. And enjoys the distinction of being the longest serving committee member. He's been 6 times the Astromine champion and is now a regular question master when that competition is held. A veteran of 4 total eclipse expeditions, 2 which were successful, and an author of an award-winning website, www.spaceandsanity.com. So I'll hand you over to Neil now. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Steve. I'll just update you there. It's now 6 eclipse expeditions, 4 successful.
Well, send me an update, please, Neil.
Will do.
The facts.
I could also say I quite possibly set a record in 2012 for the longest distance travelled by any British astronomer to not see the transit of Venus.
Well, that's nothing not to be proud of, I'm sure.
Right, I'll share my screen. First of my 2 short talks. Right, hope you can see my screen now. Okay, well, I'm obviously preaching to the choir where quite a few of you guys are concerned, but I hope you'll still find this amusing. On the 21st of August 2017, together with a few people here, I think, I was in Jackson, Wyoming, observing the Great American Eclipse, as they called it. That was my 6th total eclipse trip. My success record, as I just said, is now 4 out of 6. And I finally achieved the goal of seeing 2 successive eclipses of the same Saros series, having previously achieved the unenviable opposite. So I'm going to say a bit today about eclipses generally and my addiction to them. Though I have to admit I'm a long way behind a few of you guys. So why do some of us repeatedly spend significant proportions of our income to travel thousands of miles to see something that lasts a couple of minutes? I've often been asked by non-astronomers, perhaps understandably, why I need to see more than 1 eclipse. Surely when you've seen one, you've seen them all. In fact, the exact opposite is true. Almost everyone who's seen one is determined to see another. The title of this piece is taken from that of a book, Total Addiction, The Life of an Eclipse Chaser by Kate Russo. I have a copy signed by the author, whom several of us had the pleasure of meeting at 2 Horncastle Astronomy weekends a few years ago. She was also in Jackson, though I didn't see her. There was a lot of people there. Total eclipses really are addictive, but as Kate says, unlike other addictions, this one doesn't do you any harm, except perhaps to your bank balance. As Kate also points out, the term eclipse chaser is in fact a misnomer. We don't actually chase eclipses at all. Rather, we do the opposite. We place ourselves ahead of the moon's shadow and wait for it to reach us. So what exactly is the lure of total eclipses, which drives this rather expensive hobby? Well, words can't really describe it. You really just have to experience it. Note that I say experience rather than just see. Obviously, the most important point is that you get to see things which you can't see at any other time. Prominences, the corona, and the beautiful diamond ring. Okay, you can see prominences at any time, but only if you have a purpose-built solar telescope with an H-alpha filter, which costs about the same as an intercontinental eclipse holiday. But then there's the sheer beauty and majesty of the event. I defy anyone, at least anyone who isn't utterly dead from the neck up, and more about that in a minute, to see the diamond ring at third contact and not be emotionally moved to some extent. I've seen middle-aged men moved to tears. and there are multi-eclipse veterans who still cry. I've also heard some truly bizarre comments from people who just don't understand it. After the 1999 UK eclipse, which was my first successful one because I wasn't in the UK, I went to Bulgaria, my dad told me that he'd seen some film of it on TV and it just left him cold. I tried to explain to him that there isn't the slightest iota of comparison between seeing it on the telly and actually being there and experiencing it for real. Live images of the 2017 eclipse were, of course, broadcast extensively on the internet, but as someone very rightly pointed out in a forum, watching a live stream on the internet doesn't count as having seen it. You've only seen an eclipse if you were actually there. Shortly before I left for the States, I had a similar conversation with a work colleague, an otherwise intelligent and educated guy, who expressed his lack of interest in a tone close to belligerence. He actually said, "I've seen a picture of an eclipse, I know what it looks like, so why do you need to go to America to see one?" I told him the same thing about not the slightest iota of comparison, and he continued, "Why isn't there? What's the difference?" Well, I truly despair to think that any intelligent person actually needs to ask me such a question, but here goes. Allow me to present an analogy. One of my other interests, which I follow as passionately as astronomy, is the sport of boxing. While I appreciate that most people don't share that interest, most do have an interest to some degree in some sport or other. So in the following, you're invited to substitute boxing with whichever sport you follow and any suitable event. In the last 3 decades, I've been to a couple of hundred boxing shows, from small hall shows in local leisure centres to those with crowds of 40,000 people in football stadia. I even once realised my lifelong dream by flying specially to Las Vegas to see a major fight. My dad, who was one of those extremely rare people who profess to have absolutely no interest in any sport whatsoever, has more than once asked me, what's the point of going to London or Cardiff or wherever and paying loads of money to watch a fight when you can sit in your living room and watch it on the telly for nothing and have a much better view? Well, as anyone who follows a sport will appreciate, there's a gulf of difference between watching it on the telly and actually being there and being part of it. While trying to get that through to me dad was like banging my head on a wall, I assume most of you will be able to relate to it in terms of your own sport of choice. As a case in point, in 1995, I was privileged to be present at London Arena when Britain's own Nigel Benn beat America's Gerald McClellan in what was far and away the greatest fight ever seen in this country. I won't bore you with details, but they redefined the limits of sporting endurance with the pace and sheer ferocity of the fight. Nigel was the huge underdog, but came through against all the odds. After the event, it took me 3 days to get my voice back. A work colleague, thinking she was being sarcastic, asked me whether my shouting myself hoarse had actually helped Nigel to win. Well, given that he was being willed on by the noise of 12,000 people all doing the same, of course it did. When a guy is exhausted and needs to summon every last ounce of strength to get him through, how could he not be given extra motivation by hearing all that support? Those of us who were there didn't just watch it, we were part of it. So consider this comparison for any sporting event of your own interest. Even if you're not interested in sport, you can find similar comparisons, such as the difference between watching your favourite pop group on the telly and going to see them live at Manchester Arena. Or even better, if you like classical music, the difference between listening to Classic FM and going to the proms at the Albert Hall. Then for a total eclipse, multiply all of that 1,000-fold. But even that comparison was lost on that colleague. When I asked him, isn't there a gulf of difference between watching a sporting event on the telly and being there and watching it live, he said, no, why is there? So he's clearly never been to any live sporting event and doesn't know what he's talking about. In any case, that "I've seen a picture of one" remark is surely logically equivalent to saying, I don't need to go and see the Great Wall of China because I've seen a picture of it. Or I don't need to go to Kenya on safari because I've seen a picture of a lion. Isn't it? And I assure you there isn't any comparison. I took that picture from very close up. Notice a couple of minutes back, I again used that word experience. This is why I say there can never be any remotest comparison with seeing pictures or film. An eclipse isn't simply something you see, but something you experience with all the senses, or at least 3 of them. In a very real sense, as well as seeing it, you also hear and feel it. You hear the sounds of nature change around you. In the last few minutes before totality, as the sky begins to darken, birds stop singing and insects stop chirping as they're fooled into thinking it's night, and everything falls eerily quiet. You feel the drop in temperature. If you're in a hot country and the temperature's, say, 30 degrees, it can drop by up to about 8 degrees in a matter of minutes, and often the sudden breath of wind as a consequence thereof. Again, just before my trip, I discussed this with a friend who was a fellow multi-eclipse veteran and who was also going to Wyoming. He said, I find the last few minutes before totality a weird, spooky, hairs on the back of my neck experience. I can relate to that. It is something close to eerie or spooky, even to those of us who fully understand the orbital dynamics of what's happening. In 1999, I and 3 friends, Don Martin and John and Elaine McHugh, travelled to Bulgaria to see the eclipse that nobody saw in Cornwall. On the day, there were just the 4 of us in a field, while a couple of miles down the road, 10,000 local people had descended on one small village where an international universities group was camped. So we were very much surrounded by the sounds of nature, with a cacophony of thousands of crickets chirping. Don, who was the only eclipse veteran among us, my previous attempt had been defeated by the weather, told us that in the last few minutes before totality, everything would go quiet. I expected the sound to die down gradually, but I was wrong. At some point, as the light level dropped, all the crickets suddenly stopped chirping in unison, in a split second, as if someone had thrown a switch. And a few minutes after third contact, they all started again, equally instantaneously. Now that was weird. I said earlier that eclipses are addictive, and I swear I'm not making this story up. In 2006, there was the one in Turkey in circumstances that made possible an ultra-cheap method of travelling to see it. By pure luck, the track passed over the resort town of Shide, and out of season when the hotels were empty. So a British tour company block booked 3 hotels, chartered 6 flights from 6 different airports, and took 1,600 people. We flew out the day before, stayed a single night, observed the eclipse from the hotels, and flew back a few hours later. And Don and I found ourselves in the same hotel as Chris Lintott and the Sky at Night crew. During the partial phase, Don and I got chatting to a fairly elderly chap who'd set up next to us. He told us why he'd come on the trip. He'd been one of the many disappointed people in Cornwall and had taken advantage of this unique ultra-cheap trip to finally get to see an eclipse. He asserted that he just wanted to see one and then he'd be satisfied. We told him that before the day was over, he would have changed his mind. Once he'd seen one, he'd want to see another. He repeatedly insisted, no, just one, that'll do me, while we gently ribbed him to the contrary. About 1 minute after third contact, he asked us, when's the next one? Now we come to something far less pleasant. Shortly before going to the US, I read what was quite possibly the most appalling, outrageous, and staggeringly stupid thing I've ever read in my entire life. Many American schools that were within the eclipse track planned to, wait for this, keep the kids indoors. Seeing a total eclipse from your own hometown is not merely a once-in-a-lifetime experience, but once in several lifetimes, an opportunity that 99% of the population never get in their lifetimes. that American school kids were denied that fantastic opportunity for the sake of some demented health and safety lunacy absolutely beggars belief. This was decided not by individual schools, but at the level of district or even state education boards. Thankfully, a lot of parents apparently decided to keep the kids out of school on the day, no matter what. If I'd been a parent there, I would have said to the school, my kids are not going to be denied this experience. Take me to court if you like. Then I'd have petitioned for the resignation of the entire education board. What appalled me almost as much is that aforementioned work colleague actually agreed with that policy and claimed that he couldn't understand why I considered it stupid and outrageous. As you might imagine, our debate became a little heated. His reasoning was presumably similar to that of the education boards, that the teachers are responsible for the kids and can't allow them to run around in the dark or risk them staring at the sun. Well, if that's what they were paranoid about, why not just give the kids the day off and let the parents be responsible? Except, of course, that suitably briefed teachers would have been in a far better position to supervise the kids and show them how to observe it safely. My colleague then insisted that most people don't care about an eclipse. The kids won't even be aware that they've missed anything. My reply can't be repeated in polite company, but surely it should be up to each child to decide for themselves whether they're interested, not to have adults decide for them. He actually thought it was reasonable that they were denied the right to make up their own minds. A few months after the American eclipse, the BBC showed a programme called Wonders of the Moon, which included a section about the eclipse. They filmed a group of school kids who were lucky enough to be allowed to see it. In fact, they were bused specially to an observing site. These kids were mainly from underprivileged backgrounds. Their science teacher, who came from such a background herself, said that seeing a total eclipse when she was a kid was what inspired her to study science, and no way would she deny the next generation the same chance. During totality, virtually every one of these kids was cheering, whooping, and literally jumping up and down with excitement. So much for kids don't care. Now let's consider my colleagues' most people don't care assertion. Of course, 99.9% of people aren't sufficiently interested to travel abroad to see an eclipse, and 99% aren't even enough to travel a couple of 100 miles within their own country. But for the tiny fraction who get the opportunity in their own hometown, it's a different matter entirely. Disputed even that, claiming that for most people it's a non-event and they wouldn't bother to walk to the end of the street to see it. Not to put too fine a point on it, that's another of the most idiotic statements I've ever heard. If that's his own attitude, then he's entitled to it, but he somehow assumed the right to speak on behalf of everyone else, based on no evidence whatsoever. On the other hand, my assertion to the contrary is based on the evidence of my own eyes, and I'm sure other people here will agree with me. I've already said that in Bulgaria in 1999, 10,000 local people descended on one small village with a population of 100 because they'd learnt in the media that a lot of astronomers were camped there. My last but one eclipse was in Australia in 2012. I observed it on the beachfront at Palm Cove, a small resort village with a population of a mere 1,200, the sort of place where the tourists outnumber the locals. And of course, several of you guys were there with me. The eclipse happened very early in the morning. First contact was at 5:44 local time, only 9 minutes after sunrise. Totality began at 06:38, with the sun only 14 degrees above the horizon. By about 5:30, the entire kilometre-long beachfront was lined with thousands of people, both tourists and locals, with hundreds of the latter. So much for most people don't care. Most of the population of the town got up at 5 o'clock to see the spectacle. Later in the day, some of those people, such as hotel staff and waitresses, told me that it was fantastic, awesome, etc. I've always said that my first total eclipse was one of the handful of experiences in my life for which that latter overused adjective was appropriate. Of course, in this case, the timing helped. As it was so early in the morning, people were able to see it before they went to work. The year after the American eclipse, I heard an amazing fact, and I just wish I was still in contact with that former colleague to tell him about it. For the hundreds of thousands of Americans who travelled within their own country just to see the eclipse, without bothering to go to tourist attractions, the most popular destination was in eastern Wyoming. I was in the west of the state. And after the eclipse was over, as everyone tried to leave the region at once, there occurred the longest traffic jam ever seen in the United States, 300 miles long, with people stuck in it for 14 hours. But nobody cares about an eclipse. Our own small country had all of 2 total eclipses in the 20th century. We all know about 1999. The first one was in 1927. In 91, when I was preparing for my first eclipse trip, my late grandmother, who was then 90, told me that she remembered it. She didn't remember what year it was, but she remembered seeing a total eclipse when she was young. And she wasn't mistaken, as it was indeed total in Teesside, where she lived. She told me that she and most of her neighbourhood walked up into the Eston Hills to see it. Again, it occurred soon after sunrise. So if you weren't on the seafront, you had to get away from the houses and up to a height to get a low horizon. Now, you'd have to look a very long way to find a person less intellectual than me gran. She had only the most basic education, and of anything remotely scientific or intellectual, she was utterly 100% ignorant. I'm using that word in its true meaning of lacking in knowledge. I'm not saying she was thick, just that she never had the education that the next couple of generations took for granted. Yet she and hundreds of similarly not very educated people did rather more than just walk to the end of the street. They all got up at stupid o'clock in the morning and walked up the hills to see something magnificent. They'd read in the papers, in the days when people actually read papers as the primary source of information, that this spectacular event was happening, which they'd only see once in their lifetime, and they made the effort. In my grand's case, it must have made some kind of impression, as she remembered it and told me about it 64 years later. At the time of the 1927 eclipse, a cartoon was published in Punch magazine, showing a mother saying to a little boy, "If you don't behave, I won't bring you next time." Of course, most people appreciated the joke, as they knew perfectly well that there wouldn't be a next time for 72 years. After my colleague had made his arrogant "most people don't care" assertion, I told him the anecdote about my gran, and he still refused to be convinced. The conversation then went like this: "How many people do you know who've seen a total eclipse?" "As far as I know, only you." "Exactly, I've met hundreds." And he interrupted, "But they were all astronomers and eclipse fanatics like you." And I said, "No, they weren't, and that's my point. Of the several hundred people I've met on the eclipse trips, a substantial fraction were not astronomers or eclipse chasers at all. They were the wives and kids, or husbands and kids, of astronomers who'd gone along for the holiday, having no interest in astronomy or eclipses themselves. Many of them did indeed go to the first eclipse with precisely the attitude of, what's all the fuss about? Why are we going halfway around the world to see something that lasts 2 minutes? In the cases where they successfully saw the eclipse, not a single one of them came back saying the same. I've yet to meet a single person who's actually seen a total eclipse and then said anything to the effect of, "Big deal, what was all the fuss about?" On the contrary, I've heard of many of those very same people, literally within a minute of third contact, asking the husband or dad, "When's the next one?" Finally, on the same theme, after the 2006 eclipse, a short essay appeared in Sky and Telescope describing the experience of a non-astronomer seeing a first total eclipse. The author was a lady from Israel whose husband was a veteran of a couple of eclipses, but she'd gone with him for the first time. She began as follows. When my astronomer husband suggested that we go to Turkey for the March 29th total eclipse, I did not jump for joy. Even from Israel, traveling to Turkey with 6 children wouldn't be easy. And who in their right mind would travel all those miles for the sake of 4 minutes of shade, especially with the not insignificant chance that the whole thing would be obscured by clouds? So my husband, a wise man, presented it differently. How about a week in a hotel by the beach alongside the Taurus Mountains, sightseeing among medieval castles and shopping to my heart's content? So off we went. Then came a description of actually seeing the event. The title of this piece said it all. And with that, I rest my case. I'll stop sharing that for a moment. Hope that was okay.
Right, thank you, Neil. I think what we'll do
do you want to take questions on that one, or shall I go straight on?
Anybody's got a question, if you can wave at me, put a digital hand up. Peter Lloyd, can you unmute yourself, please?
Yes, thank you for that account, Neil. I just wondered whether you're planning to go to South America in December.
In a word, no.
I have a very bad history of eclipses. Having looked forward to the 1999 one since I was a small child, I found myself in California. Flew all the way back here and of course didn't see a thing. I booked myself to go and see the American one, changed planes in Vancouver and collapsed on the way out of the plane and spent the relevant day in hospital in Vancouver. So I planned to go to South America, but it may never happen.
That's the worst story I've heard yet.
Thank you.
Yeah, my first successful one was 99. I went to Bulgaria, as I said. If I'd already seen one, then I might have gone to Cornwall for the chance of seeing one in my own country. But as I hadn't seen one, my previous one had been beaten by the weather, I decided to go somewhere with a good chance of actually seeing it.
Oh, very sensible.
It was very hot on the day. It was about 35 degrees.
Neil, what type of equipment do you take with you?
Just a camera with a big lens.
Just a camera with a big lens. And
I just take a camera with a long lens.
And I know that our eclipse chasers do a lot of preparation beforehand with making sure kit runs smoothly. They know exactly where buttons and levers and things like that are, and they can work in the dark.
Your guys take a lot of kit.
And so on. So do you go through that same level of preparation?
Probably not the same level as your guys, because I don't take anything like the same level of kit. But what I do, particularly when it's only a short duration eclipse, 2024, if I actually manage to get there, might be a bit easier because it's 4 minutes in totality. But all the ones I've actually seen successfully have only been between 2 minutes and 3 and a bit minutes of totality. So what I always do, I just take a camera with a long lens, and so I want to take a sequence of photos. I want to obviously take some at the diamond ring at second and third contact, and a digital SLR is a godsend for getting the diamond ring, because you can use the burst feature where it takes 3 frames a second. And that's what I do. And at each of the diamond rings, each second and third contact, I just put it onto burst mode and hold the shutter for 5 seconds. Take 15 shots in 5 seconds, and at least one of them is hopefully going to come out okay. Then during totality, I want to take a sequence of different exposures, short exposures for prominences and longer ones for the inner corona and then the outer corona. So I plan in advance the sequence of exposures that I want to take, and then depending on the length of totality, work out how many seconds apart I need to take them to fit them all in comfortably, and then leave a bit of time at the end to just stop and look. And I pre-record a set of instructions. I take a voice recorder with me, and I pre-record a set of instructions and time it, and just, you know, on the day I replay it with an earpiece, and just I pre-record a set of instructions as saying set to such as exposure and take it now to ensure that I can run smoothly through the sequence within the time. So
okay,
that's mainly the preparation I do.
right. Okay, thank you for that. I've never thought of having your sequence recorded and playing in your ear.
That was my own idea, but I've since heard of other people who do it as well.
Okay. All right, Pete. Well, all right, Neil. If nobody else has got a question, and I'm looking around, can't see any hands, either blue or waving at me. So if I spotlight you again.
Okay.
Let's try that again.
Second talk is even shorter. This one won't take very long. This is called Way Back When. So share screen again. Bear with me while my slideshow wakes up again. Right, here we go. Okay, way back when. What that means will be revealed. We astronomers are accustomed to stating the distances of stars and deep sky objects in light years. The light year, of course, is the distance light travels in a year. The speed of light is a whopping 2.99792,458 times 10 to the 8 meters per second, or almost 300,000 kilometers per second. And for all those old gits like me, when we were kids, we learned it as 186,000 miles per second, or 186,282 to be exact. So that speed times a year is a very big distance. It's about 9.5 million kilometers. And just to help you visualize how far a light year is, my car is now 11 years old, and it's done considerably higher than average mileage, averaging over 300 miles a week. And just after its 10th birthday, it reached 1 light second. And don't worry, I did, of course, turn off the M1 and made sure I was on a minor road when it hit that number, so I could safely stop and take the photo for posterity. But think about this. The distance of an object in light years is the time it's taken for its light to reach us. So we're always looking into the past. If a star is n light years away, then we're seeing it as it was n years ago. For most stars, this doesn't actually make any difference. But think of objects that change appreciably over time, such as supernova remnants that are constantly expanding. It's often said that the Crab Nebula is the remnant of a supernova which exploded in the year 1054. That's when the supernova was observed on Earth. But as it's 6,500 light years away, it actually exploded 6,500 years earlier. And we are seeing the nebula now as it was 6,500 years ago. So I've taken some nearby stars and some more distant deep sky objects and equated the distances to historical events that were happening here on Earth when the light that we're now seeing was emitted. I'm not overly concerned with accuracy. I took the star distances from an old book, so some might be a bit out of date, but who cares? You get the idea, and that's what matters. For events in the 20th century, I've found stars that fit exactly to the year, specifically for giving the talk this year. Going further back, the fits are approximate. Beyond about 200 light years, the distances are often only given to the nearest 10 anyway. And in many cases, you can find 2 or more widely different values for the distance in different sources. So I've unashamedly picked the one that fits. As we all know, the nearest other star to the Sun, which we can't see from our latitude, is the triple system of Alpha Centauri, which is 4.3 light years away. In fact, the very faint star Proxima is the nearest of the 3 components. So when our Aussie friends look at it now, they're seeing light that was emitted while we were having the dreaded Brexit referendum. Megrez, or Delta Ursae Majoris, is 63 light years away. So its light left it just about when Sputnik 1 was launched and the space age began. The most famous variable star, Algol, is 105 light years away. So we're seeing light that began its journey during the First World War, and when Albert Einstein was publishing the general theory of relativity. Eltonin, which is the brightest star of the constellation Draco, despite not being called Alpha, is 117 light years away. So we're seeing light that left it as the Wright brothers were building the first aeroplane. Staying in Draco, Thuban, which is the Alpha star but not the brightest, and which was the pole star several thousand years ago and had great significance to the Egyptians, that's 220 light years away. So its light has been travelling since just before the Battle of Trafalgar. Probably the best known double star in the sky is Albireo, or Beta Cygni, which is 410 light years away. So how about this? We're seeing light that left it just about when Galileo was first using a telescope. We all know Betelgeuse in Orion. It's about 520 light years away. So we're seeing it as it was while Columbus was colonizing the West Indies. And here's a thought. It's said that Betelgeuse is going to go supernova any time now in terms of cosmic timescales. So it's just remotely possible that it already has, but we don't know it yet. The open cluster Messier 39 in Cygnus is about 830 light years away. So its light began its journey when King Richard the Lionheart was fighting Saladin in the Crusades. Now for an obscure star that's gained some significance. Kepler 20 was the first star found to have Earth-sized planets. It's 950 light years away. So we're seeing light that left it shortly after the Battle of Hastings. Well, I had to find something to fit that date, didn't I? This, of course, is part of the Bayeux Tapestry, which shows the battle. And that, if you can see my cursor, is Halley's Comet. It was seen just before the Norman invasion, and it's shown here in the tapestry as being a warning for poor old King Harold. NGC 7000, the famous North American nebula, is about 1600 light years away. So its light has been travelling since about the time when the Roman Empire began to decline. M57, the Ring Nebula, is 2,280 light years. So we're seeing light that was emitted when Eratosthenes was a teenager, 20 years before he measured the size of the Earth in 240 BC. Another open cluster, M37 in Auriga, is about 4,500 light years away. So its light left it roughly when the pyramids of Giza were being built. The globular cluster, M15 in Pegasus, is 40,000 light years away. Its light began its journey when our ancestors, early Homo sapiens, were living alongside the Neanderthals. M31, the Andromeda Galaxy, is usually said to be the most distant object visible to the naked eye, at 2.4 million light years. We see in light that left it when our almost human ancestors, Homo habilis, first began to migrate out of Africa. M91, one of the galaxies of the Virgo cluster, is 63 million light years. So we're seeing light that's been travelling since shortly after the Cretaceous tertiary extinction event, which wiped out the dinosaurs and 70% of all life on Earth, and which we now know was caused by an asteroid impact. And finally, we come to 3C273. This is the brightest quasar and is widely regarded as the most distant object visible in amateur telescopes at a whopping 2.4 billion light years. When the light we see began its journey, the most advanced life forms on Earth were cyanobacteria or blue-green algae, which were just beginning to use photosynthesis, the process that releases oxygen into the atmosphere and ultimately enables all animals, including us, to exist. And with that, we come to the end of our journey through both space and time.
Thank you, Neil. That's a rather sobering little talk you've just you've just delivered. Thank you very much for that. Right, I think you could have a whole new career with Hallmark, the birthday card people, working out light year for birthdays. So, once again, ladies and gentlemen, after that very, very short presentation, has anybody got any questions? Nobody at all. You've astounded people. So,
that
Neil,
must be a first, reducing Mexican Swinton to silence.
Neil, it's because we're all spread out. That's what it is. We need a critical mass to be close to each other to get any sort of radioactive chain reaction going. Neil, going back to your first question, have you got anything on the slate? You said the South American eclipse is off the books this year. Have you got your eye on another trip?
Well, the next one I'm planning is 2024 in the States again.
Okay.
8th of April 2024. But whether that's going to happen is anybody's guess. And from a personal point of view, it depends very much on when I manage to get back into work. Because as I told you earlier, my job has been totally wiped out for this year and for the foreseeable future. And apart from that, who knows at the moment whether trips are going to happen at all.
Right.
We've got, the airline industry's died, hasn't it? And the way things are going in the States, will it even be safe to go there by 2024? We have to wait and see, don't we?
Well,
and in fact, in terms of the organised tours, such as the tours with Intrepid Holidays, which I went with in 2017, in normal circumstances, John Mason and some of their team would have been in the States around now or even before now, making the plans for it. So again, God knows when they're actually going to be able to get over and plan it.
can I bring Tony Morris into the conversation?
Yeah.
Tony, can you unmute yourself? Good evening, Tony.
Hi.
Hi, Tony.
Tony, what's your take on travelling abroad at the moment? And do you see a quick return to eclipse chasing?
No. Using the Johns Hopkins website, looking at the daily stats for South America, as people understand, Brazil's in a bit of a mess. But the actual daily infection rate in Argentina, which is one of the main spots for the eclipse later on this year, is actually increasing drastically at the moment. So we are currently waiting Intrepid to get back to us to tell us whether or not the tour is going ahead or it's being cancelled.
Right. Okay. So it looks like bad news all around.
Well, the WHO and the Foreign Office are basically saying, don't go to South America.
Right.
So if they say that, effectively, you cannot get health insurance.
Yeah.
And traveling in a pandemic with no health insurance is probably not the wisest of things to do.
And you can't fly into Argentina either because their airspace is closed.
Yeah,
thank you, Gary. Peter Lloyd.
I can just add to that in that I'm booked on a tour to go to that eclipse, Chile and Argentina, and the company concerned are still going on the assumption that the tour will go ahead. And they're putting in the most enormous precautionary measures. We've all got to take masks and hand gel and all this sort of stuff. I do have health insurance for it because I took it out over a year ago.
And fortunately, before all this stuff blew up, and I've talked to that company, and they say that if the government are still advising against going, and I decide not to go, even though the tour is going ahead, they will pay all my money back, because the tour company obviously isn't going to if the tour goes ahead. And I think the only thing that will stop them is if Argentina and Chile still have their borders closed in December. But remember, it's summer down there, so their rate could be falling off by then.
Well,
so I just have to wait until November and make a decision.
Well, there's more to it than that, Peter, because the guidance within Argentina is if you are a foreigner in a hotel, basically you can't leave the hotel.
Well, that would stop it as well, wouldn't it? Yeah.
Yeah. So we're currently booked with Intrepid, and we're waiting feedback from them. But Intrepid Australia are in the midst of legal battles with a lot of their customers, because Intrepid have been effectively backdating their terms and conditions, trying to get out of paying you money. So beware.
Well, I'm with an outfit called Asco Trails, which do this sort of thing specifically. And yes, I've paid them an awful lot of money, and the terms say I won't get it back. But they've indicated that if the tour does not go ahead, then I will get it back from them.
Well, that's good. That's good.
Well, it'll put them out of business, I should think, because after all, they must have a suitable number of expenses.
Yeah. The other thing with all this, Pete, if you're travelling about the country, we saw how the coronavirus shut down our infrastructure. And if you go into another country that's got maybe a weaker infrastructure, there's nothing.
I think a lot of it also depends on what type of holiday you're on. So certainly, like Tony said, we're with Intrepid, which effectively is a bed and breakfast. So you're dependent on sandwich shops and restaurants being open, or the hotels being able to fully cater for you throughout, because otherwise you can't get anything to eat. And certainly internal travel inside Argentina is heavily restricted at the moment.
Yeah, I'm sure it is.
And it's like Tony said, we're just waiting for them to cancel. And effectively, they've said they haven't, because like it's interesting things like if you're flying to Buenos Aires, you can't leave the hotel.
Right. Yeah, I suspect that my company will cancel it, but they're not prepared to say so until much nearer the date.
Well, the reason why we're expecting some feedback from Intrepid probably within about the next week to 10 days, because it's 3 months before the holiday and they've got to pay their ground crew in Argentina. And obviously they'll not want to fork out their money because they might not get their money back off Argentina. So they reckon that's when they'll cancel it.
Yeah, I mean, I know my company hasn't, because they sent me the final demand for the final amount that I've got to pay before, I think it's the 10th of September. So they think it's going ahead, but I should play it by ear when I get nearer the time, because if it goes ahead and I decide not to go, I can get it back from the insurance company.
Okay.
Yeah, there's other slightly more complex things to consider. I've been following a blog of somebody riding a motorcycle through basically Patagonia to Alaska. And when they were in one of the South American countries, there was quite a bit of hostility, because the local people in the small village thought it was foreigners bringing in the virus. So it's quite a complex thing that goes off in these environments when there's a pandemic. I'm not an expert, but we're kind of all learning this as we go on, aren't we?
Yeah. There's another thing I hadn't thought of. Thank you.
Okay, I think we'll move the conversation on.
Yeah,
And,
thank you.
But thank you for everybody who contributed to that part of the evening. So has anybody else got a question or an observation to make for Neil? No? Okay, so can, in our usual Mexborough and Swinton manner, give Neil our thanks.
Thanks very much.